Most people think they know exactly what kind of fear comes from a horror movie. A sudden jump scare. A dark hallway. A possessed doll sitting quietly in the corner of a room. And when the credits roll, that fear is supposed to stay on the screen. You turn off the TV, turn on the lights, and life goes back to normal. But every once in a while, a story comes along that refuses to stay in fiction. The strange thing about the character people know as Chucky is that most viewers assume he was simply invented by a group of Hollywood writers in the late 1980s. Just a creative idea for a killer doll movie, a marketing gimmick designed to tap into childhood nostalgia and twist it into something terrifying. But if you start digging through old case reports, archived news clippings, and a handful of disturbing police interviews from the 1970s and early 1980s, you begin to notice something unsettling. Certain details in those real cases look uncomfortably familiar. The kind of familiar that makes you wonder if the movie wasn't entirely fiction after all. And before we go any deeper into this story, I should probably say something. If you enjoy real-life horror investigations like this, the kind that slowly uncover the darker parts of history people don't usually talk about, make sure you're subscribed, because some of the stories coming next on this channel are even stranger than this one. Now, to understand why people sometimes question where the idea of Chucky really came from, you have to go back to a time when the concept of haunted toys wasn't part of pop culture yet. In the early 1970s, children's toys were becoming more advanced. Voice boxers, pull strings, blinking eyes, dolls that could talk, dolls that could move their arms. The goal was simple: make toys feel more lifelike. But occasionally, that line between lifelike and unsettling became very thin. One case that rarely gets discussed today involved a small suburban neighborhood outside Minneapolis in 1976. A boy named Eric Patterson had just turned 8 years old. For his birthday, his parents bought him a large talking doll from a local department store. The kind with plastic hair, bright painted eyes, and a voice box that repeated cheerful phrases when you pulled a string. According to family members interviewed years later, Eric loved the doll at first, but after about 2 weeks, things started to feel off. It began with small things. Eric's mother said she would sometimes hear the doll's voice box activate late at night from the hallway closet where Eric kept his toys. The doll would say the same phrases it always did. "Hi, I'm your friend. Let's play. Want to be best friends?" But there was one problem. The string that activated the voice box was never pulled. At first, the parents assumed it was a mechanical issue. Maybe the toy was faulty. Maybe the spring inside the voice box was loosening. But then Eric started saying something strange. He told his mother the doll was talking even when the voice box didn't activate. Not out loud, but quietly, as if someone were whispering directly beside his bed. Children say strange things all the time, so his parents didn't take it too seriously. They figured Eric had watched a scary TV show or heard a ghost story at school. But about a week later, something happened that made the situation harder to dismiss. Eric's older sister, Daniele, woke up around 2 in the morning to the sound of movement in the hallway. At first she thought it was their dog walking around, but when she opened her bedroom door, she saw something she would later repeat, almost word for word, in a police interview. She said the doll was sitting in the middle of the hallway floor, facing her bedroom. Now, the Patterson family insisted the doll had been inside Eric's closet earlier that night, and no one in the house claimed to have moved it. Again, there are logical explanations for things like this. A child playing a prank, a tired memory, someone forgetting they moved something. But the strange reports didn't stop there. Over the next few weeks, Eric began refusing to sleep in his room. He told his parents the doll didn't like being ignored. He told them the doll got angry. And according to a short report from a local social worker who briefly evaluated Eric during that time, the boy described the doll using language that sounded oddly specific. He said the doll had another name. When the social worker asked what that name was, Eric hesitated for a long time. Then he said the doll told him it used to be a man. Now, if you grew up watching horror movies, that detail probably sounds very familiar. But here's the part that makes the story difficult to categorize as simple childhood imagination. Several months later, Eric Patterson was involved in an incident at school that shocked his teachers. During recess, another student was pushed down a set of concrete steps behind the gymnasium. The fall left the child with a broken arm and a concussion. Witnesses told the school principal they saw Eric standing near the top of the stairs right before it happened. When teachers questioned him, Eric insisted he hadn't pushed anyone. He said the doll told him to stand there and watch. The school contacted Eric's parents, and eventually a child psychologist became involved. The psychologist's notes from that evaluation were never made public, but a retired police officer who later spoke about the case said something interesting. According to him, Eric's description of the doll's personality didn't sound like a child inventing a fantasy friend. It sounded like a child repeating something he believed was real. The doll, Eric said, didn't talk like a toy. It talked like an adult. Calm, patient, sometimes irritated, almost like it was teaching him things. Now, stories like this usually fade into local rumor. Families move away. Records get archived, people forget. But the Patterson case isn't the only example. In the late 1970s, another report surfaced in New Jersey involving a teenage babysitter who claimed a large talking doll inside the house would move positions throughout the night while she watched two young children. Police eventually concluded nothing criminal had occurred, but the babysitter refused to return to the house. And years later, when interviewed by a local newspaper doing a story on urban legends, she repeated the same details she told officers that night. She said the doll didn't just move. It seemed to watch. Here. Stories like these might sound like coincidence or exaggerated memories. And honestly, that's probably the most reasonable explanation. But here's where things start getting interesting. When the first Child's Play movie was released in 1988, the writers described the origin of Chucky as a serial killer, transferring his soul into a children's doll. A fictional concept. If you're just joining now, this is the continuation of the Patterson case we started earlier. The strange investigations surrounding Eric Patterson, the talking doll, and the disturbing events that followed in that quiet Minneapolis neighborhood in 1976. What you're about to hear picks up exactly where the earlier part left off, because the details that surfaced later are what made this story linger in the minds of investigators for years. But if you compare the behavior of the character to certain statements recorded in earlier, real-life case files involving children and talking dolls, the similarities start to look strangely specific. A toy claiming to have another name. A toy that behaves more like an adult personality. A toy influencing a child's behavior. Again, none of this proves anything supernatural. In fact, psychologists have a very grounded explanation. Children between the ages of 6 and 9 sometimes externalize their thoughts through objects. Dolls, stuffed animals, imaginary friends. It's a way for their developing brains to process emotions and fears. But here's the part that keeps some investigators interested in stories like this. Sometimes the details children provide feel too structured, too consistent. And sometimes, those details appear in places they shouldn't. Years after the Patterson case, a retired detective who had briefly reviewed the incident gave a quiet interview during a documentary about urban myths. During that interview, he mentioned something that had never been included in the official case summary. Eric Patterson didn't just say the doll used to be a man. He said the doll told him exactly what kind of man. A man who had hurt people. A man who liked watching people fall. The detective admitted he originally believed Eric had simply overheard adults discussing the school accident and built a story around it. But the strange part was this. Eric described that personality weeks before the stairway incident happened. And according to the detective, there was one final detail that stuck with him all those years. When the psychologist eventually asked Eric why the doll told him these things, the boy answered in a way that sounded less like imagination and more like quiet fear. Eric said the doll liked it when people believed it was just a toy, because that meant no one paid attention. Now, to be clear, there is no verified evidence that any real doll has ever been responsible for anything like what movies portray. Toys don't come to life. Plastic doesn't think, and most investigators who study these stories will tell you the same thing. Human psychology is powerful. Memories can change. Children can unintentionally blur the line between imagination and reality. But even knowing all that, there's still a strange feeling people get when they revisit stories like this, because sometimes fiction seems to mirror real life just a little too closely. And if you grew up watching the Chucky movies, this might be a good moment to pause and send this video to someone who watched those films with you as a kid. Because there's one more piece to the story that rarely gets mentioned. The Patterson family didn't keep the doll. After Eric's behavior became concerning, his parents quietly removed it from the house and threw it away. At least, that's what they told investigators at the time. But years later, Eric's sister Danielle told a slightly different version of the story. According to her, their father didn't throw the doll away immediately. He put it in a trash bag and stored it in the garage overnight. And sometime after midnight, Danielle woke up again to the sound of movement downstairs. When she looked out from the staircase, she said she saw her father standing in the garage doorway, holding the doll, just staring at it. The next morning, the doll was gone. Her father never explained what happened that night, and he never allowed another talking toy inside the house again. Eric Pettison grew up, moved to another state, and according to public records, lived a quiet and relatively normal life. He never spoke publicly about the story, but people who knew the family later said there was one habit Eric never lost. Even as an adult, he didn't like dolls. Not in the casual way most people dislike creepy toys. In a very specific way, he avoided them completely. Store, aisles, toy displays, even antique shops. If he saw one sitting somewhere unexpectedly, he would leave the room almost immediately, which, honestly, is probably understandable. But the thing that keeps stories like this alive isn't proof. It's the unanswered parts. The small details that don't fit perfectly into neat explanations. The question of whether movies like Child's Play simply used common childhood fears, or whether someone, somewhere, had heard stories like this long before the cameras started rolling. And maybe that's why certain horror ideas stick with us for decades. Not because we believe them, but because somewhere in the back of our minds, they feel possible. So now I'm curious what you think. Do you believe stories like this are just examples of childhood imagination and misunderstood psychology? Or do you think some horror movies borrow more from real life than people realize? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. And if this story made you look at childhood toys a little differently tonight, you're definitely not the only one.